For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. Our guest analyst today is Ambassador D.B.Venkatesh Varma. He's been India's ex-envoy to Russia and Spain. Ambassador Varma, good to see you in person after a while and do an interview with you physically. How do you see the last 12 months or so of the Russia-Ukraine war in terms of where it stands?
Well, we've now almost done a year. Last February, the war began. It's been a prolonged war. But in terms of geopolitical conflicts, a year is actually not very long. It's a moment in time, because geopolitical conflicts take place over a span of decades. And the war actually has its origins in a civil war between Russia and Ukraine. It has acquired all the ferociousness of a civil war. It is also got the territoriality of a geopolitical conflict. And it is seen massive incendiary stimulus through external intervention of a very massive scale that we have not seen in recent past. Now, each of these are feeding on each other. Russia has occupied a substantial portion of the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. That has not abated the civil war. In fact, some of the Ukrainian groups are even more determined than before to roll back Russian intervention. Russia has occupied the entire sea face of the Azov Sea. They have a substantial control over the Ukrainian coast on the Black Sea. Of course, still Odessa is still in Ukrainian control. And the military preparations that are presently undergoing, and we will see military action in a very major sense, say in the next couple of weeks, some of which have already started, centered around Bakhmut. But I think the issue is whether very strong Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass will hold out to the expected Russian offensives that will play out in the next couple of weeks. Now, it is to prevent that, to prevent Ukrainian defenses from falling apart. The West, the United States and NATO, are now escalating the levels of military assistance. Initially, they started off, Ukraine fought with its own weapons. Then it used ex-Warsaw Pact inventories that were there in Eastern Europe. And then NATO started supplying more advanced weapons. Now NATO is already giving them almost their own frontline weapons. The levels of escalation are not abating, and that's the unfortunate part. There has been a nuclear dimension as well, including some attacks by Ukrainians through drones on Russian nuclear bases. So that's pretty much a matter of escalation. But the United States and Russia are also in touch with each other on the nuclear question. So the war is grinding on. But I think we are fairly clear on where it is heading. There will be a portion of Ukraine that will go into NATO when the war ends. And the other portion of Ukraine is something that the Russians will be determined to occupy. That said, 1 year on, it is safe to say that the stalemate will probably end in some sort of ceasefire with Russia gaining the upper hand, but surely laying the basis for a contested ceasefire and a division of Ukraine.
Almost a year back, exactly a year back, you wrote a piece as well, and some of the key points that were highlighted there, as you said, geopolitics of war is 1 year is just a blip. USA being drawn into this quagmire was one of the points. The other thing that highlight was also that what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. You want to elaborate on that year on?
Yeah, I wrote this piece on the 24th of February 2022, exactly a year, exactly on the day that the war began. And it was called the Putin pushback, essentially saying that the war did not begin on 24th February. It has a previous history, and it was not entirely unprovoked. Russia was trying to correct a systemic weakness that it was unable to correct or to stabilize ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union, manifested in the 5 waves of NATO expansion. But in 2021, late 2021, 22, Russia came to the conclusion that even though victory was not assured, a bad situation would get worse if indeed Ukrainian resistance was not broken through the use of military force. It can be argued that Russia may not have anticipated the fierce Ukrainian resistance. That is, I think, quite possible. I think that's true. But then the United States also did not recognize that the 5 waves of NATO expansion would result in Russia using military force. NATO expansion as a diplomatic strategy was immensely successful up to the point that Russia used military force. But once Russia used military force, and given the geopolitical interest that Russia has, it would put in all resources to prevail in that conflict. And I think my analysis has been borne out by the last 1 year. The article also said that Ukraine would suffer. Unfortunately, that is the case, despite very valiant and heroic defense that Ukraine has put up. But the fact is that 10 million people have left their country. Their civilian infrastructure is in ruins. Half their country, especially in the south and the east, is under occupation. The article also predicted that the United States would come back in a very big way into Europe, and that's exactly what has happened. The United States has given over $100 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. This amount in such a period has never happened before. The Europeans, as NATO members, have had to pay both the political and economic costs, and of course the instability that has ensued because of the war, Russia-Ukraine war. European security is now in shambles. It is tempting to see that this would be a passing affair. It will not be so. As I said, geopolitical conflicts are slow burn conflicts, and today it is Ukraine. Russia has a number of contested peripheries, and the temptation of NATO and the United States will be to see how to keep up the pressure on. The debate in the West has changed from a perception of acute Russian weakness, a vilification of the Russian leadership, to now a consideration of various proposals to see how, if Russia is not going to lose, then what do they do with Russia prevailing in the conflict? Russia using force was not good for NATO. Russia prevailing in Ukraine will be even worse for NATO. So I think the temptation will be to carry forward the fight. That would be a mistake because Russia is weak, but the fact is that the United States is overextended. It is getting deeper into the quagmire in Europe. And if it gets deeper into European security, overextension is also another form of weakness. So for us, looking at at it from our part of the world. Both Russia and the United States engaged in an endless conflict, which is of a geopolitical nature, with no end in sight, is not really a good turn of events for us.
Talking about a turn of events, Ambassador, when you're looking at the overall picture of where the world is in terms of the global order or disorder, where do you see the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and how would you put it in context to the changes that are taking place in the global order?
You see, the global order that we talk about actually was pinned by a territorial understanding between the largest continental state, which was then the Soviet Union, and the United States, which was the most powerful maritime power at the end of the Second World War. And it was pinned down and agreed in terms of the Yalta and Potsdam agreements. The Yalta and Potsdam agreements notionally survived the breakup of the Soviet Union. But then the extension of NATO, plus the acute perception of Russian weakness, which was true in a sense in the 1990s, but remained less so in the decades past thereafter, especially after President Putin came to power. I think American policy to pressurize Russia, predicated on Russian weakness, I think has been now a major mistake. Russia trying to protect its peripheries through the use of military force, until now not with much success, is also another mistake. So you have two big global powers wallowing in their own miscalculations, with huge costs not just to relations between them, but also more systemically. I think the global order that we spoke about for the last 70 years has unraveled. The United States' perception of Russian weakness is so acute that even the fact that Russia is a peer equal in terms of nuclear arsenal has not prevented the exertion of political and now military pressure on Russia. So deterrence, in a sense, has broken down. Russia is trying to re-establish deterrence by gaining a military victory on the battlefield, because now that is the only means through which deterrence calculations can be recalibrated. Russia has been unsuccessful so far, but if Russia does prevail, then the question will arise in Washington and in Brussels, what next? NATO has been expanded. You've seen Finland and Sweden wanting to join NATO. But the Baltic front is not the only front that is of concern. There's the Trans-Caucasus, there's Central Asia. So the whole hinterland of continental security was assured for the last 80 years on the premise that it would not be challenged by extra Eurasian powers, which is Western Europe and the United States. But that is now falling apart. Unfortunately, the only beneficiary of this turn of events will be China, which is well positioned. China was extremely weak in 1945, 1949. Like us, it had no way of influencing the territorial settlements that were agreed in Yalta and Potsdam. But now it is in a much more advantageous position. Russia is committed one way, the United States is committed another way. My sense is that the United States will find it very, very difficult to conduct a dual contingent policy across the entire Eurasian continent, which is Russia on one side and China on the other side. The United States' influence is now on the peripheries of the Eurasian continent. It is very strong in Western Europe through NATO. It has substantial presence in Korea and Japan. But these are the two peripheries in which the United States is positioned. And never in history has dual containment of an entire continent been And the United States budget, defense budget is already about $800 billion. The U.S. defense budget, along with the NATO defense budget, is about $1.3 trillion. The United States debt is about $32 trillion. So we are not exactly looking at robust, productive superpower capacity. The United States is still a very, very powerful country with huge capacities in defense, in science and technology, in the economy, and great vitality in the economy. But overextension, the answer for overextension is not more overextension. The answer for overextension is a sensible grand strategy. The United States is very strong, but a strong United States should also be a sensible United States. With regard to Russian weakness, I think we will have to see through a decade of where Russia, now pretty badly wounded in terms of its global engagement, will sort of pull into itself. There will be a certain contraction of the economy. Its defense capacities are being tested. If they prevail in Ukraine, it will be a big boost. But Russia itself will find it very difficult to match the means at its disposal, which are not very substantial, to the expanding security threats it now faces across its entire periphery. That said, we should only hope for a modus vivendi between the big powers. And unfortunately, dialogue is broken down. It's not just communication and dialogue. I think the propensity for mutual accommodation amongst the big powers has broken down. I guess it will remain so until one side or the other prevails militarily on the ground in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian war, how the Ukrainian war spins out, will have, I think, pretty tragic consequences for Ukraine itself. But I think will also be the harbinger of a new phase of big power relations between Russia and the United States. That said, this is not the only game in town. There is the whole competition that is brewing between US and China, and that's a different ball game altogether.
So how would you assess India, Ambassador, dealing with the global powers in a situation like this? I mean, when you talk about rules of the game, international rules, rule of law, it seems to be that the big powers are not affected when they want to use military power in that sense. So the whole debate about principle when it comes to sovereignty and territorial integrity and practical policy, if you want to touch upon that.
Well, last year I think was a year of considerable stress for Indian foreign policy. But I must say that India has acquitted itself very well. I think we made the right call on the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February last year. It was based, I think, on a calculation that there will be no quick winners in that conflict. Of course, Russia crossing the red line of sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine was noted, and that is a principle that we support. But I think essentially we did not agree with the Western framing of the conflict, which is that it was unprovoked aggression. It was not. It had a certain history going back several decades. And as I explained, it was not just a civil war. It is a geopolitical pushback by Russia, and it has now got the manifestations of a massive external intervention. We have positioned ourselves well in this emerging multipolar situation. And the emerging multipolar situation is that you first need to protect your wicket. I think we've done it rather well. There was a calculated risk in February. I think that calculated risk has, we've been vindicated in that. Our bilateral trade has reached over $30 billion. We have engaged with Russia and with the others in the international community for our energy needs, fertilizer, coking coal. We have taken collective steps with regard to banking and financial institutions. And of course, we've also engaged with Russia very closely on the fact that we need to stabilize our huge Russia-related, Russian origin inventories in our defense forces. This year, and I guess will be quite challenging for us, but we need to draw the right lessons. Russia is not just a legacy military partner for us, and that is, I think, we make a mistake in making out that Russia is the past and someone else is the future. I think life is not so simple as that. But I think we need to do business with Russia in the new way rather than repeating the old patterns. So a certain recalibration of our Russia defense relationship is required. This is a very good opportunity for getting the Russians interested in getting their supply chains to the Make in India program. I think the government should take proactive measures to do that. The diversification away from Russia had begun prior to the Ukraine war. In fact, it had been going on for several years before the Ukraine war. I think the Ukraine war has underlined the urgency, but the urgency is not to cut and run. The urgency is to recalibrate and use the Russia relationship to our advantage. There will be several battle-tested systems that will now become available from the Russians. But as long as it is consistent with our requirements, as long as it supports Make in India, as long as it's affordable and there's technology transfer, I think the Russia relationship will, my sense, will only increase. Russia has stopped supplying over 113 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe. Yeah. The gas flows to the west will now be available for gas flows to either the east or the south. There's already a substantial Russia-China equation on energy. It is in our interest that Russia, which will have additional and excess gas and other forms of energy, should see India as a priority partner. And therefore, we should look for an energy alliance with Russia, a new energy alliance with Russia. Because if we are to get cheap, preferential energy sourcing from Russia, I think it will be a boost for our economic development. Just as we would like to have a technology partnership with the United States, I think it is equally important for us to have an energy partnership with Russia. So the Russia-Ukraine war will be a catalyst for major global changes. And I think we are well positioned, given Prime Minister Modi's equation with President Putin, our diplomatic skill that we have demonstrated over the past year, and the increasing weight of India in the international system, including our chairmanship of the G20, which is coming up. I think we are well positioned, and I think, but these will be tectonic and systemic changes that are taking place, and the time is now to make the right moves.
As you said, it's not the only game in town, the war in Ukraine, and India has repeatedly been telling the West and anybody else who wants to fire over our shoulder, from our shoulders, about that. China in the global change. How do you see India and China?
Well, 2-3 things about China in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. I think some of the presumptions that we made that Russia was weak, Russia would lose the war, and Russia would then therefore become a vassal of China, I think these are all wishful thinking analysis. I think these have been disproven. But the fact of the matter is that China has gained a strategic advantage globally, which it would preposition itself to take full advantage of. So it is in our interest that we keep the China equation on a matter of stability, or basis of stability, through increased deterrence of our bilateral relationship. The problems that we've been having with China is, in a sense, related to the fact that there has been a weakening of the deterrence relationship. So that has to be reestablished. But I think we also need to work the international system to see that that unilateral Chinese advantage is minimized. But it will be a very complicated situation. The trade between Russia and China is about $200 billion. But the trade balance is now slowly shifting in Russia's favor. The trade between the United States and the EU with China is about $1.3 trillion. The United States and Europe are repositioning themselves on the technology architecture of the world, which is being weaned away from the larger system of globalization and new controls. These are both challenges and opportunities for us. But I think our ability to manage the global order is now much better than it has been in the past. People talk about the global order giving one global order giving way to another. It is not the global order per se, but I think where you stand in the global order. And the global order after 1945 has generally been not so supportive of India's interests. In 1947, when we became independent, our territorial integrity was not supported by the then big powers, including at the Security Council. We wanted economic development program of our choosing, and there were few takers except the Soviets who came to support us. Similarly, in terms of our defense equipment, in the nuclear order, in 1967 when the NPT was finalized, the NPT had a blind spot on China, which remains the biggest weakness of the NPT. At that stage, the Americans did not have diplomatic relations with China. The Soviets were about to go into war with China. The Chinese had 180,000 troops supporting North Vietnam in the war against America and South Vietnam. Despite these factors, it is quite amazing that the line in the sand, which is 1st January 1967, on what constitutes the dateline for who will be a nuclear weapon state and will not be a nuclear weapon state, was handed over a platter to China. 60 years on, China has not reduced one nuclear weapon because of its membership of the NPT. So the arms control process is in decline. The non-proliferation regime is on the brink, including the problems in Iran and DPRK. So we have now a situation where China, which is undertaking the largest military build-up this century, both nuclear, missile and conventional and naval, has not a single international multilateral instrument that constrains its growth. So I think before we reach this stage, I think we need to have all the wherewithal within our own defense forces to see how deterrence can be re-established with China, not expecting much from the international system to constrain China in the near future.
Mr. Varma, absolutely appreciate your time and sharing your experience and expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. And if you like this video on the topic that we've chosen to discuss today, do hit the thumbs up on YouTube. Do share this link as well. You can also help support us financially. There's a QR code that is flashing on your screen, and the link is in the YouTube descriptor. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.